warm welcome to this podium. we had today's close discussion on exactly this topic: transatlantic security, European security, Ukraine, and how to deal with Russia. And we are very happy to have here a very nice, very interesting panel with colleagues from Berlin, from Ukraine, and also from the US. This whole event was a cooperation with the Council on Foreign Relations. We will have a Zoom also version here. It's off the record. It's on the record. Sorry, it's on the record. I was the whole day off the record. And I have to excuse my voice. So I try to speak as less as possible. Unfortunately, I got somehow sick. Just maybe to frame the topic for today's discussion, the re-election of US President Donald Trump and a new German coalition government under Chancellor Friedrich Merz brings a new dynamic into the negotiations on the war in Ukraine and on US-Europe security relations. Germany is willing to spend 500 billion on infrastructure and additional money on defense, and it's finally willing to end its debt brake with this. So I think it will be a kind of a center of gravity also for Europe in terms of military spending. The new German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Johann Wadephul, even supported the 5% goal on defense spending demanded by the US President Trump. And I think this will be a major topic also of the upcoming NATO summit. The Trump administration wants a deal with Russia and end this war. It is willing to make huge concessions towards Moscow at the costs of Ukraine and European security. We will have to see how this is going to work, and this is something to discuss also this evening. At the same time, Russia is not willing to make any concessions, even increasing its demands for Ukraine, and it's just going on with its brutal war in Ukraine, despite the offers of the US on negotiations. And I think for Ukraine, this is a very difficult situation since it's dependent on European and US support, and only the US can supply certain kind of weapons, ammunition, and intelligence. So I think without the US, we would be in a very different situation. Kiev has agreed on a mineral deal with Washington to keep the US on board. We see that the Europeans are more active. We see this coalition of willing now also. I think the big upcoming event is the NATO summit in The Hague. And also the question will Ukraine be invited or not for the summit? What kind of signal will be sent out? And I would like to discuss this evening with our four speakers here. We have Angela Stent everybody's to my left, who is non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute, professor emerita at the Georgetown University, and also senior associate at DGRP here. Angela, warm welcome again. Norbert Röttgen, member of parliament, governing coalition, CDU-CSU parliamentary faction. I don't think I need to introduce you in this environment. We have Oksana Osacha. She's advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine for the European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And Ms. Stefanishina also got additionally Minister of Justice of Ukraine. So I think this is, the most important ministry with the most important topics domestically and in terms of foreign and security policy. Warm welcome to you. And we have Stephen Biegun, who's former US Deputy Secretary of State, very, very experienced diplomat and state official also in the US on these issues. So I would start with a panel discussion and let then like half an hour, maybe a little bit more for you for the Q&A. Let's start in the order also we have in our invitation with Norbert Röttgen, and I would ask the same question then also to Stephen Biegun from a US perspective. do we have the same threat perception on Ukraine, on war, on Russia's war in Ukraine, and in terms of European and transatlantic security in Germany and the US? So what is our threat perception? Is the US threat perception the same, or does the US see different kind of threats in Europe and with regard to this war? Norbert Röttgen, please.
So going directly to the heart of our discussions, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate a lot to have the conversation with you and, of course, with everybody who is attending this event. So do we have the same threat assessment, I would perhaps say, between Germany and Washington? And perhaps to be more precisely, between Germany, more or less, or the German government and the White House or the American administration, not fully congruent assessment of threats, but of course not also fully divergent. Perhaps I start with a brief description of how we assess the threats we are facing. So I'm talking about the threats we think Germany is facing. Could also say Europe, but let's stick to Germany, is facing. So I would say there, I would mention three. Number one, of course, is the war that is taking place. Certainly the battlefield of this war is Ukraine, but our threat perception is that this war matters fundamentally for European and also German security. Because among others, this war describes the attempt of Vladimir Putin to reintroduce war as an instrument, a tool of foreign policy in Europe in the 21st century. And if he were going to be successful by this attempt to make war again acceptable as one element in the toolbox of European foreign policy, this would fundamentally change the security of Germany. And if he were successful, he won't stop certainly in Ukraine, but would go further. His historic mission he is adamant to pursue is to re-establish Russia as a European empire. And this matters massively, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe and the rest of Europe. So this is number one. The number two is our assessment, and the German defense minister and the military leadership of Germany are speaking publicly about that. Our assessment of the Russian industrial rearmament strategy and program indicates beyond doubt that Russian ambition goes far beyond Ukraine, but that they are instead preparing to be able to wage a continental war beyond Ukraine. So assessing the visible military ambition and what their targets and plans are, we can see that Russia intends and is working to be able to go beyond Ukraine by applying war against Europe. So this is number two. And number three, and then I come closer to your question, is what has also changed for us and has changed the security arena and architecture in Europe is that our view, my view, is that this administration, for the first time since America entered World War II, does not consider European security as a genuine major American interest. This has been different over 80 years. America has done what it did not only out of generosity towards the Europeans, but it was an assessment of American interests. And Trump does not consider European security an American interest. And this changes the security situation for Europe. We could have seen this long before. We were resistant and hesitant that this would come, certainly, because we could have seen that America is overstretched both by domestic and international requirements and demands, and that for America it is simply not possible to pursue the same policy as they did during the Cold War. So the Cold War is now over for more than 30 years, and we could have reckoned and expected this change. Now it comes very fundamentally, very quickly, and we have to assume to accept the consequences and to assume the heavy weight to provide and organize conventional security for on our own. This is new. And perhaps the last element I would like to mention is that certainly the American president started with his idea to bring about not peace, because peace requires much more than a truce, but an end of the war, on the basis of his assessment that charming Putin and pressuring Zelensky could bring about an end of the war. And this certainly has never been our German and European assessment of where the root causes of this war lie and how we have to respond to that. Hopefully, and I think due to due to a new European initiative, the forging and shaping of a political coalition of the willing is trying to bind and tie Trump more closely to Europe. Everybody knows this is more easily said than done. But we can observe that the frustration of Trump is growing with Putin, and this may, over time, and we are working on that, I would say this is one of the main elements of European diplomacy, to tie closely and reliably America to Europe, and this is one centerpiece of European diplomacy we are applying and pursuing.
Thank you. Stephen, I would ask you the same question in a way from the US side. So where is Europe on the US priority list? And what is the threat perception here? So what role plays Ukraine and the Russian war in Ukraine for this US administration?
Well, thank you, Stefan. And there's much that I agree with in Norbert's answers. The only things that I would express a reservation about is where he's expressed some concerning trends. I think the jury is still out as to where U.S. policy finally settles. So America right now is certainly challenged to speak with one voice. So to ask if America has the same threat assessment particularly from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also the value of the transatlantic security, is to ask the impossible. But if you wanted to speak to what is the American view, I can give you tangible statistics. The least popular global public figure in American polling is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has a 90% disapproval in the United States of America. He's deeply unpopular. The vast majority of Americans, a significant majority, strongly support a enduring NATO alliance, binding the security of the United States and Europe together. 65% of the American public strongly supports the NATO the NATO alliance. The United States Senate just 1 year ago this month voted to approve $91 billion for aid to Ukraine to help sustain Ukraine's defense. Largely the exact same Senate that we have today. 70 United States senators voted 1 year ago to provide that assistance to Ukraine. In 1998, 70 United States senators voted to expand the NATO alliance to bring Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in, same number of senators. In 1949, 70 United States senators voted to pass the North Atlantic Treaty. There's a deep continuity in America's thinking on transatlantic security. America's foreign policy is something of a three-legged stool. Our foreign policy stands on the legs of our interests, our values, and our capabilities. And there has to be some balance between these in order for American foreign policy to be successful, but they don't change dramatically between presidencies. In fact, history would tell me that leaders and events change much, much more quickly than the interests of the nation, which is why after American elections, you often see some shift to the middle, some reversion to the mean in U.S. foreign policy, because U.S. foreign policy responds to U.S. interests. And there are two very clear interests of the United States that are guiding our nation's thinking on transatlantic security and the war in Ukraine. The first is that the peace and prosperity in Europe is a strong, even vital U.S. national interest. And this is still a prevailing view in the United States of America. The second is that the United States must stand on the side of inviolability of borders, not to be changed by force because of the chaos it would unleash in the world. These are two enduring American interests, and they give me confidence that in the course of time, U.S. foreign policy will remain very much dedicated to this mission. Now, I understand that a lot of the rhetoric, some of the insults, the pressures that have come about in even just the last few months from the United States are deeply unsettling. I fully understand that. But I would also encourage you not to allow the rhetoric and the execution of policy to disguise for you the fact that there is an underlying problem. Europe has become too dependent upon the United States of America for its security. Germany, 5 years ago, was barely topping 1% of its GDP to provide for its own defense. At the same time, the United States was spending multiples of that. And let me tell you what I told, I'm no longer in office, but what I told your ambassador at the time. Do you not think Americans want good schools for our children? Good roads, and safe roads, and hospitals where our parents can get their care? We had to make hard choices, and we've made very hard choices. But that's good news, too. Europe is doing the right thing. Germany is especially doing the right thing. The steps that your new chancellor in the coalition that he's now leading took to remove the debt brake to prevent you from spending on defense, the increases with supplemental funds and soon to be on a sustained basis in the German defense budget. We now are have an entirely different problem, which is to figure out how to most sensibly use the defense resources that are being put in place by our European partners. So I don't want to leave this on a sour note. We have been through a very difficult time, and we're continuing to work through that now. I share everything in common with Norbert's view of the threat that Russia poses, and so do many other Americans. I think there is still a pathway, though, for us to work through this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oksana, let's move to Ukraine. I would ask, what has changed for Ukraine with the changing US government? Are there changing roles also in a way? So is there a different role for Europe now, or maybe even increasing role for Europe? How do you see this whole game changing also if we look into this rapprochement of US administration with Russia also?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting. It's a pleasure to be here. You mentioned in the beginning of the event that we are now in the difficult and complicated situation. Honestly saying, I hardly recall that we were not in the complicated situation. So for us, it's a more usual environment to have some challenging things ahead of us. Simply the setup of those challenges changed a little bit. And what is important here is to have this general perspective that with transatlantic unity and with US, of course, we have a stronger stand against Russian threat. And we are ready to work on it together with our European partners. As President Zelensky mentioned, we are comfortable with having the United States as an ally and a partner. And having now like the decision of the president that United States is more mediator than a partner is of course something that we need also to adapt to. But we understand that we need to continue this dialogue and we need to continue this communication with the United States and to deliver our messages and to deliver our vision of what the peaceful solution actually means for us. We have quite pragmatic but fruitful experience of negotiations with the United States on the rare mineral deal. It was not particularly easy in the beginning, but I think finally we engaged in quite a constructive dialogue with the US administration. And the final document, which was signed, even some skeptics inside of Ukraine agree that it has some prospects, economic prospects, and actually benefits for the Ukraine in a little bit longer term perspective as well. Also, just to be here on the safe side, I have to say that we are really thankful for the support being provided. And for each cent and euro cent of the support, we are grateful. And believe me or not, but no one desires peace more than Ukrainians. And having, missiles and shaheds flying over your head is not a very pleasant experience, every single night. That's why, of course, peace is something that we desire a lot, and we support the attention of the President Trump to achieve it. The only thing is that in terms of ceasefire, it's very hard to actually proclaim ceasefire unanimously if you are defending. Because if you are defending and proclaim ceasefire and stop shooting in response, it means actually that you are basically saying capitulate. That's why in all the conversation on the ceasefire, we agree that it should be done also from the Russian side as well. And so far, we haven't seen the intent of Putin to actually be serious about it. Also, in terms of peace, definitely just and solid peace needs a lot of pressure and persuasion on the Russian side. We hear and we see a lot of messages from Russians with their demands, and our delegation went to Turkey to meet with the Russian delegation directly, and we hear the Russian demands, which were repeated, which haven't particularly changed since the Russian understanding of the roots of the conflict. And basically, we understand that keeping the Ukrainian statehood and keeping the possibility, sovereignty to make our own decisions, that's what's on the stake here. It's not that much about the meters of the territory. And here also I call for the colleagues that drawing some lines on the map might be easy if you don't think about the people who are living on this map. Because for us, it's not only about meters and meters of the territory, or kilometers, but it's also about the Ukrainian people. Some of those people live here as well because they have basically nowhere to return. And it's very important to think from that perspective that any legalization of Russian gains and any legalization of Russian not gains as well, because that's what they want to, will also mean a lot of suffering and a lot of actual implications for the people living. And in that regard, also for us, it's very important. Here also I see a lot of opportunities for Germany to step up, is to make Russia understand that despite all the political flares and dialogues and communications and phone calls, there is one objective thing which is going to be recognized by the Russians, that Ukraine is no longer part of the Russian Empire, and that Ukraine will not be part of the Russian Empire. I think that's the most challenging task because it requires a lot of actions and a lot of resources to do that. First and foremost, it requires strong Ukrainian armed forces, and we learned our lessons. And I also need to echo Ambassador Bigan that it's yes, in some way we also were not that smart during the years of independence, when we were also dismantling some of our defense capabilities. And now we learned this lesson and we invest a lot in our defense industry. In 3 years, we basically increased the capacity from $1 billion US dollars to $35 billion US dollars. Under the war conditions and under the Russian strikes, I think this is kind of an amazing result. And we also developed those capabilities that we previously didn't pay much attention to, including long-range missiles. We are working on that, but it's definitely not enough. And here we count absolutely on our partners. And we want to make it more pragmatic, as not charity, but rather mutual production and mutual understanding of the threats that are ahead of us. Our defense industry is open for investments. We are thankful for the Danish model and we want to expand it. So this is the first point. Ukraine needs to be strong enough to deter any attempts in the future of Russian aggression. I'm not very comfortable in using the term security guarantees here, but it's more like deterrence capacity. And it can be different, and we are thankful for the coalition of willing, for the ambition to actually extend that to even the presence of the military trainers and the deterrence forces in Ukraine. This is a path to go, but we understand all the hardships related to the ceasefire and the backstops that we are facing on this way. And another important piece of that is actually EU integration. And despite all the hardships, potentially closing and actually increasing the interoperability with NATO to the extent when the political decision of actual integration would be possible in future. So on that, we count on the EU partners also to deliver on the European accession track. We did our job in terms of opening the foundations cluster. We just approved the roadmaps for the public law reforms and for the institutional developments and rule of law. So we expect that the decisions on opening the negotiations on this particular cluster will follow. And there will be a way to persuade one of the European Union members not to block us on this way. And in that regard, also definitely a stronger European voice on sanctions, solution on the application of Russian frozen assets for the reconstruction, also for strengthening of Ukraine. These are all the parts of one big decision that whatever Russia does, whatever, other hybrid, conventional, not conventional ways Russia finds to influence Ukraine and our partners, one thing remains unchanged, which is that Ukraine gained its independence in 1991. Somebody says that it was granted, but now I think we really prove with blood and with our determination that we are different and we want different life from Russians, that we actually earned it and deserved it. So if you can help us and stand with us on this way, we are ready to be your partners and also to support you in your endeavors and in your security as well. Thank you.
Angela, let's move to US-Russia relations. I think we have these two tracks with the Trump administration. One is on Ukraine, and the other one is on normalization of the relations with Russia. How realistic is this from your perspective? Is there a reset possible? So where are these US-Russia relations moving?
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for inviting me back to the DGAP. I was just remembering 20 years ago being on a panel with Sergei Markov here, just after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and he said very confidently to me that the CIA had paid every demonstrator who was out on the Maidan in 2004 $10 a day to demonstrate. I then said that was cheap. Okay, but you ask a very important question. So 10 years ago, I wrote a book about US-Russian relations and how every president since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Republican and Democratic, had tried to reset relations with Russia in different ways, and that all these resets had ended in disappointment. And the reason they had ended in disappointment was because US presidents, again, Democratic or Republican, had a very different understanding of the drivers of world politics than the Russian leaders did. And of course, there have only been really two leaders since then, if you discount Medvedev, who I guess was technically president. I think the difference today is that we actually have a president and some of the people around him whose worldview is much more similar to that of Vladimir Putin. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. First of all, the skepticism about allies, and I think we've heard some of that here, that allies, act as a drain on your resources, they constrain you in what you should do. And secondly, I think the concept of sovereignty, the idea that there are really only 3, possibly 4 truly sovereign countries in the world, Russia, the United States, China, and maybe India, and that all other states, smaller states, in fact, have limited sovereignty. And then the corollary of that is, and of course, Vladimir Putin has talked about this quite often, that the current world order is collapsing and that the new world order should be one in which you do have, again, spheres of influence. It's a kind of mixture of, if you like, 19th century and then Yalta, which is a system that Putin praises greatly. And so you divide the world up into spheres of influence. You do whatever you want in your sphere. The smaller countries that live in your sphere have to adapt to you. And then you leave the other countries' spheres alone. I may be slightly exaggerating, but it really is. You have a fundamental shift, I think, in the current US administration's, or at least some people in it, view of the world, and that it's not that dissimilar from elements in Putin's worldview. So when President Trump came in for the second time, he really wanted to improve ties to Russia. We know that he tried to do that during his first term, but it was very complicated. There were restraints on it. And so as Stefan said, you have 2 tracks now that are going on. You have a US-Russia negotiation on ending the Ukraine war, on possibly agreeing on a ceasefire, on what happens after the ceasefire. And of course, the main negotiator here is not someone with a formal diplomatic position in the US government, but it's Stephen Witkoff, who is a businessman, a very long-time friend and associate of President Trump's, and who has been doing a lot of this negotiating by himself. One of his counterparts is Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And one element of all these negotiations is that you have to offer Russia some carrots, if you like, if you want concessions on ending the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, I could say facetiously that historically, if you look at a period of decades, the Russians and even the Soviets usually eat the carrots that they're given if you don't have sticks too. That's the metaphor. But anyway, that's the one track that's been going on. And that track, of course, is very difficult, complicated, as we've seen in the most recent phone call between President Trump and President Putin, because as far as many of us can see, President Putin is not interested in ending the war. What he's interested in is the second track. It's the restoration of US-Russian relations, the reset, and that would involve lifting most of the sanctions on Russia. It would mean the end of Russia's isolation from the West. Russia isn't isolated from China or much of the global South, but it still is pretty isolated from the West. And it would possibly also involve US investments in Russia and in helping the Russian economy grow again. It's right now, of course, on a wartime footing. And I think President Trump himself is also very interested in this reset. He still believes that there's the possibility of major economic deals with Russia. And we hear that time and time again, that there's this huge vista. We know that since 1987, when he first visited the Soviet Union, President Trump was very interested in doing business in Russia, a huge market, and that he's still interested in that. Now, we can also go into a discussion about how realistic this vision of these greatly expanded business deals is. And a large number of American companies and some European companies too were kind of badly burnt by their experiences in Russia. And then, of course, after the war, the full-scale invasion happened. Many of them pulled out. Many of their businesses were appropriated by the Russian state and then given to people who were close to Vladimir Putin. So we can really question how realistic that is, but that's part of the dialogue. And then I think the other point of view from President Trump's point of view is he really is interested in strategic stability talks and in dealing with the nuclear issues and the nuclear threats that having nuclear powers in the world poses. Whereas the Putin regime refused to negotiate with the Biden administration on strategic stability after the full-scale war broke out, because the New START agreement, which is the only remaining major agreement between the US and Russia regulating strategic nuclear weapons, that expires next year. And it is, in fact, imperative to do that because otherwise we face huge challenges of proliferation. So I think that is another element of what President Trump would like to accomplish. In the first Trump administration, they really wanted the Chinese to take part in this, and they do today as well, I think for very obvious reasons, since China's nuclear arsenal is growing quite quickly. So far, the Chinese have demurred. But if we put that part of it aside, I think that's another important element of it. And as far as I can see now, I think these negotiations on a reset, which also includes some other negotiations on just restoring some of the diplomatic ties that have atrophied since the full-scale invasion began, that track is going to continue. It's quite possible that the US-Russian negotiations on ending the Ukraine war won't continue in the form they are now. We've had various indications, both from the president, the vice president, and others, that the US might walk away from these negotiations if nothing can be accomplished. But I don't think that they're that interlinked. And so I think you could get a steady improvement of US-Russian ties even as the war goes on.
Thank you. I think a very important point. This double track. Let's have a bit quicker second round. I'm coming back to Norbert Röttgen and would like to ask, what do you expect from the Friedrich Merz government in terms of supporting Ukraine and redefining Germany's role in European security? So do we get the Taurus? Is there really a difference to the former government? Will there be quicker decisions? I think now the framework is there, the budget is there. So I think this creates reality, but now action is also needed. Will we see this?
So you are absolutely right. The yardstick for the new government is action and not announcement or talk. You're absolutely right. I agree. I have talked many, many times with Friedrich Merz about all these issues of Russia and Ukraine, and he's absolutely determined to bring about a new idea of Europe and of the German role within Europe. He knows, he has internalized that this is our responsibility. It's a European responsibility. And it's our security, and there will not be a European security without Germany. Germany, on its own, can't resolve any problem, but without Germany, Europe will not come into existence as an acting foreign policy power in our own interests. He knows it, and he will do it. And to lift the debt brake, particularly from the CDU perspective, We established the debt brake after the international financial crisis in 2009. And this was a holy grail in our policy ideas. And it, of course, has resulted in a situation that, unfortunately, fortunately for Germany, but unfortunately for Europe, there is only one among the large European economies that has significant fiscal capacity. It's only us. And this tells something about that the idea of the debt brake was not completely wrong, because it has reserved a capacity to act when needed. But now we have understood that this is time now for action. So we have abandoned the constitutional constraints of the debt brake for only one area, and this is defense and security. And we will make use of it in both respects, putting pressure, economic pressure, via additional sanctions on Russia, and a stronger, determined, sustainable support for Ukraine in both military, civil, or in both military and civil terms. And I'm absolutely certain that this is going to happen. If I were forced to define the idea, the ratio essendi of this coalition in one sentence, I would say it's exactly that Germany contributes to the emergence of Europe as a security power, because we have understood how the world, America and Europe, has changed.
Will there be more German leadership in Europe also on this? I think this was also the criticism on the former government. There is a lack of European leadership from the German side.
Yeah. Yes, and we should not shy away from the term European German leadership. We always know that German leadership within Europe does not mean that we dictate what others have to do, but it means to become a leading power for European action and initiatives. And in this sense, we are ready, and the Chancellor particularly is ready to assume German leadership to enable Europe, to make Europe emerge as an acting power. And I would say that we have already seen the results of it. We have seen in the last 2 weeks, more of Europe than in the last 2 years.
Thank you. Stephen, what is the expectation on Germany and Europe with regard to Ukraine and European security from this administration, from this US administration? And where do you see NATO here also? Is there this whole discussion about the European wing in NATO? Let's strengthen the European wing. We take more burden here. And what is then? What is the reaction then of the US? So what does this Trump administration expects from Europe and Germany, and what would be the consequence then?
So what are our expectations for Germany? That's what you're asking. Sorry, the expectations will be sky high, maybe even unrealistically high, but they'll be sky high. But it seems for the first time that Germany is going to make a real effort to meet the expectations too. You have a new chancellor. He's clearly brought a fresh wind of leadership in on areas of mutual interest, like transatlantic defense and security. He's kept Boris Pistorius as his Minister of Defense, something that's very well received in the United States. So it's a strong government. That Norbert mentioned it, I mentioned in the beginning too, the commitments on defense. This is all good. And I think what the challenge for Europe and the challenge for Germany is going to be that the United States is going to give more space for Europe to figure this out than we probably have in a very long time. And if I was being truly honest about some of the things that led to the the imbalance in defense over the past decades. It's the United States had a certain role it wanted to play in Europe as well. And we have to acknowledge that we weren't necessarily creating the space for Europe to do the things that Europe wants to do as Europe. And so I think there's a real opportunity here. In the United States, we have a tradition to give our new leaders a honeymoon. I don't know if you honor that in Germany, but it was certainly with the United States, there's a welcome to the new chancellor and every wish he'll succeed. I was reassured or encouraged on Monday when I was reading of President Trump's phone call with President Putin. Nothing in the phone call encouraged me, mind you. But what encouraged me is after the phone call, the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, was one of the people the president spoke to just to get some feedback and have an exchange. I think it's a very good sign in these early days.
Oksana, Ukraine is applying for NATO and for EU membership. NATO membership at the moment is with a big question mark. How important is this EU membership for Ukraine? So how this because I think one is for security, the other one is for transition, for transformation. But since NATO is not on the table, does this impact also on the importance of the EU membership as the only option at the moment also to get integrated into Europe and this part of the transatlantic security?
Thank you so much for the question. So first of all, in Ukrainian constitution, we have the provision for NATO and the EU membership. As of now, the constitution hasn't changed. And also we don't have the intent inside of Ukraine to change it somehow anytime soon. So for us, in practical ways, we continue to work on the both tracks, the European and the Euro-Atlantic one. So for NATO, as of current situation, of course, we understand that we need to be more practical. We have a lot of ongoing projects launched also at the Vilnius summit and the Washington summit. So we do have the Joint Analysis Training Education Center, the first ever NATO-Ukraine institution in Bydgoszcz. We have also the interoperability roadmap, and we are absolutely intending to continue this work. And we are in touch with our NATO partners how to make it effective for the longer term development of the Ukrainian armed forces. And as I mentioned, the strong Ukrainian armed forces and defense forces, we see that as one of the conditions for Russia to adapt to new situation when Ukraine is no longer the part of the Russian sphere of influence, sphere of interests, or whatever you can call it, basically as a euphemism for Russian empire. So for us, NATO agenda is still on track. Maybe it will require a little bit more time. I'm dealing with NATO integration for already more than 15 years. There were different periods, including non-block policy. But we think that this is yet another stage which we need to consider and adapt. In terms of the EU integration, it's absolutely, and you absolutely correctly mentioned, that this is a matter of also transformation inside of the country. You mentioned the Orange Revolution, also had the Revolution of Dignity, and this was the strong people's voice and people's will that Ukraine share the same values with Europe and that we are the part of the European community. So this stands, and all the surveys, public opinion, like as of now, we still have very, very high level of public support towards the European and NATO integration. Maybe like now people recognize that the European integration is not only about values, it's also about very painful and practical work. We have a lot of dialogue also with Ukrainian business now about the practical things on this track. But what we see on the part of the parliament, on the part of the business and civil society as well, is the recognition that EU road is not that easy, but everyone is ready to accept those hardships. Because first of all, it's again, returning to the European family in a way. Second, it's a kind of vaccination against the Russian Ruski Mir, which they advance in some of the Ukrainian territories. And it's also the future generations' choice, civilizational choice as well. So what it helps in the practical terms, it helps also to consolidate people around joint tasks. And in very practical terms, European integration also helps to use resources efficiently because it's about transparency, it's about fighting corruption. And if you fight corruption, it means that you use your national budget more effectively for your needs. It's about rule of law, so people will feel more secure and more on the good terms with justice in Ukraine. And of course, it's about the economic prosperity and for business and investments as well. So I think that's indeed strategic track for us. We are committed, we will continue to be committed, and we hope that this year, despite all the hardships, those 3 clusters, at least 3 clusters, will be opened for the negotiations track, and we also work already on the future 3 to be opened in the near future.
Thank you. And the last question before I'm opening up on China, I wanted to ask you, for me, it's not entirely clear what this Trump administration expects from Europe and Germany on China. I think we had before some very clear messages, but I also have the impression there is an interest to make a deal with Xi directly. So what is the policy? Can you assess it maybe of this administration on expectations of Europe on China? So what do they expect?
So whereas it's pretty clear to me what the Trump administration's policy on Russia is, it's much less clear what it is on China because it seems to be contradictory. You know, on the one hand, we had these huge tariffs that were initially imposed. China waited it out. In the end, the US and China negotiated, and now they've lowered them. On the other hand, President Trump quite often says he respects and admires President Xi, and they can get along well. So I think ultimately he would also like to restore or create, I don't know if I can use the word reset, a stronger relationship with China. Now, as far as Europe is concerned, one could say, at least until now, that the tariff policy is pushing Europe and China closer together. That even though, again, the tariffs on the EU at the moment have been lowered, but we don't know what will happen at the end of the period of 90 days, and we don't know what will happen with China. And it seems to me that the Chinese now see an opportunity, again, with Europe to improve ties. Now, I think you were alluding to the fact that in the Biden administration, there was a lot of pressure on Europe, on Germany, but other European countries to distance themselves in terms of the economic relationship with China, what they were importing Chinese technology. And after a number of hard-fought discussions, many European countries, in fact, agreed to do that. I think those constraints have been removed now. I don't see anything at the moment from the Trump administration that's trying to put any pressure on European countries, to lessen their economic integration or dependence on China. I thought it was interesting that the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was at the Munich Security Conference, and he talked explicitly about improving ties with Europe. And so I would think for the moment going forward, I would envisage closer EU or individual European countries' ties with China, and really not much of a reaction from the Trump administration.
Thank you. Let's open up for questions. I would collect. You can introduce by name and institution. Please questions and no long statements. And let's start here.
Thank you so much, Magdalena Kirchner of Stiftung Mercator. I have a question to Norbert Röttgen. You talked when you had the discussion of Germany and Europe. There was the sense of the coalition of the willing, and we saw the pictures and the Weimar Triangle, but that means that they're also unwilling. So what are you anticipating in conflicts within Europe, different threat assessments, different ideas on Ukrainian accession of the European Union? And what's your strategy to make sure that the other ones are also following or are not sabotaging or undermining the strategy? Thank you very much.
Machen wir bei Rolf Nickel hier gleich weiter und dann bewegen wir uns.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting debate. I have one question to Angela. You talked about the interest in strategic stability talks on the part of the administration. Do you foresee anything on arms control with respect to sub-strategic nuclear weapons on this one, or is this completely out of the question?
Sorry. All good.
Klaus Wittmann, Potsdam University, and formerly in the military. I have a question to Angela Stent. Can you tell us something about the so-called Graham Initiative in the Congress, about very tough, a package of very tough sanctions? And is there a certain hope that Trump, once Putin's intransigence has worn up his patience, would turn around and not just say we will walk away, but support Ukraine all out? And one question to Norbert Röttgen. The Merz line, which you described, action, not just announcements. How united is the coalition on that? For years I have been criticizing the Chancellor and Rolf Mützenich and some others, and I noticed that once the Chancellor mentioned Taurus, immediately the new faction leader, Miersch, said not with the Social Democrats. This does not bode well. Perhaps he continues where Mützenich has left off.
Okay, then let's move there. Maybe then we give it back and have a second round.
Thank you so much. I have a question on Ukrainian colleague Alexandra. Oksana, I would like to know.
Can you introduce? Okay.
Yes, Alexandra from Makaro Foundation. I would like to know if you have some kind of ideas or plans or about support from Berlin, or are you already preparing for kind of a security plan also without Western support?
So let's maybe give it back and then have a second round. Angela, maybe we start on arms control. Can you take the microphone?
So mostly what I've seen is a discussion of, what happens after New START and kind of strategic nuclear weapons. I have not seen much of a discussion about sub-strategic weapons. I think we also know that the US is going to be spending more on building new weapons and on its defense sector, because there's been criticism that under Biden and other presidents, it wasn't enough. So I just haven't seen that. That doesn't mean it's not happening. But my sense is that the discussion, and again, we don't know the substance of most of the discussions that Mr. Witkoff has had with Vladimir Putin, and I don't know how much this has come up, but I haven't seen anything, about that. Now, on the sanctions bill, yes, there's a very tough sanctions bill, which has bipartisan support in the US Senate, because the vast majority of US senators are very concerned and very hawkish on Russia and supportive of Ukraine, not all of them, but most of them. And I think it, would include much tougher sanctions on countries that purchase Russian energy. It would include tougher sanctions on Russian banks. I mean, it's a really tough sanctions bill, but the president would have to sign the bill. And so far, at various points, President Trump has threatened sanctions when he's been displeased with what Putin has done. For instance, when there was, there's been increased, obviously, Russian bombing and shelling of different Ukrainian towns, and he's mentioned that. And he said a number of times, if they don't, negotiate in good faith, we will impose more sanctions. But so far, he hasn't. And so I think there's some skepticism among people about whether he would be willing to do it. And if you ask me, is there some kind of a red line beyond which he would say, okay, I understand that Putin's not serious about this, and now's the time to impose more sanctions on Russia? I don't think anyone quite knows what that is.
Norbert Röttgen, please.
Yes, of course, I want to start with the interesting question whether when there are willing countries as members of the coalition of the willing, there must be also some unwilling. However, I would respond, the major and main alternative of the concept of doing European foreign policy on the basis of a coalition of the willing is more to say we are doing it on an intergovernmental basis as opposed to the integrated basis of acting on that in the sense that the EU organizations are acting. So this is the real alternative. How should we proceed to do European policy? And I would say that the practical answer is, or what we know that we have to be decisively, substantially, and quickly. And the European integration process started with the idea to put at the core of the European integration defense. And as everybody knows, the French Parliament rejected this idea. And then the second attempt was put the economy and the market at the center of the European integration process. So we are, as a consequence, the European Union, is not equivalently and so well equipped in our foreign policy instruments, also including the competencies of the European Union to act, mainly meaning that defense has remained a competence of national parliaments and the member states and has not become a European competence. So the consequence out of now this necessity to adequately, quickly act means that we have to opt for an approach that is based on the competence of nation states, of the member states, more so than on the competences of the European Union. Not in a mutually exclusive way, but how can we act quickly? It is that you can put 5 or 6 or whatever heads of states or governments into the train, but certainly not 27. So the procedures within the European Union would be too awkward, too slowly, too complicated, and the disagreements among the 27 would be relevant there, because on foreign policy, we need regularly unanimity, and everybody knows that Hungary and Slovakia are not on the same side regarding Russia and Ukraine policy. So this is the major reason. This does not mean, and of course, we do not have any intention to do it against the European Union. And the European Union is also in security matters working there, where security is also a matter of security is also a matter of the internal market legislation. For example, if tariffs, if sanctions against Ukraine would be passed by imposing tariffs on Russia, it would be done via the competence of trade regulation, which is a sole European competence. So we are doing this on this intergovernmental basis to yield results quickly, decisively, visibly, aligned with the European Union, but also beyond the European Union, where only member states have competences. Perhaps put it like this. And then how united is the coalition of the willing in the German government. So we were united, criticizing the former government for doing too little, too late. And I really would, and of course, I was part of the negotiations on foreign and defense policy, so I could tell a lot about this, and that the natural impulses of the different part of the two major parties, the CDU-CSU and the SPD, are not totally the same. So there are different traditions, different impulses, and sympathies, and so on. However, we have really come to the conclusion I alluded to or tried to describe in an earlier statement here in this debate. We know what is at stake, and everybody in this coalition knows it. What is at stake if Russia wins, if Ukraine loses? We know that there is a heavy burden to avoid this historic catastrophe on the German government and the majority of this coalition in parliament. So irrespective of all nuances and perhaps different views, we are really determined. We are really bound together by knowing that this, what you alluded to and related to in your question, describes the historic, the moral, political, but the historic dimension of this government. Whether we deliver or we fail will have quite certainly consequences, not only for years, but more decades to come, and we know it, and we know what is at stake.
Okay, it's a strong statement. Oksana, are you preparing for a worst case scenario? I think that was more or less the question.
Thank you so much. I just wanted a little bit to add on the question about the German support. It's a little bit maybe more like personal view, but I'm literally happy that the German government decided to be more mysterious about the weapon supply. I think this is a very wise decision. It leaves a little bit strategic ambiguity for Russians. The best announcement for any delivery of Ukraine is actually application of this delivery in the front line. It's my stand here because the communications are important, but it's better to have post communications in this particular regard. And on the worst case scenario, so if you don't plan for the worst case scenario, you're a very bad planner. And our military planners literally spend a lot of time with like nationally and also with the support of our partners in modeling different scenarios and counting the capabilities that we need to avoid the scenarios or like change them. So in that regard, I think we do have an understanding of the resources and capabilities that we need, and we do have an understanding of what happens if those capabilities are not achieved. The question here is just to keep in mind who is our adversary and the resources of our adversary. So Ukraine counter-aggression of the nuclear power, like in terms of people in Russia, they have like 140 million, and they have huge mobilization resource. Yesterday's announcement of our general staff is that we are approaching the number of 970,000 of Russians soldiers killed already in action. We don't have this courtesy of spending that human resource. And if most of the resources can be supplemented in terms of money, in terms of weapons, like our most precious resources, our defenders. And we need to be very cautious about that. And in that regard, the answer is very simple. It's technologies, innovations, and more effective weaponry. So that's why I think if you're asking if we do have some understanding of what we need to be self-sustained, yes, we do. Do we have enough resources as of now to become self-sustained tomorrow? No, we don't, but we are working in this particular direction, including in development of our defense industry. And plus, I think we need to delineate here in terms of political support and in terms of also the cooperation with industries and businesses. And I think, again, with EU track, we are very much optimistic about EDIS, EDIP, European Defense Industry Strategy and Policy. So we see here opportunities for the Ukrainian defense industry to be part of it, and not only to benefit from it, but actually to contribute. And with that regard, I think that we would love to avoid the worst case scenario as much as we can. We recognize that capacity of Russia and Ukraine are a little bit not compatible in terms of, especially now, plus we have the rearmaments of Russia, and in all the negotiations which are now being conducted with Russia, personally, I haven't heard any demand from Russia to actually somehow cut down the military production or intention to somehow control Russian armaments program. So Russia will continue to militarize, and not only economically, but also ideologically. And we see that. That's why in longer term, we will definitely want to be more self-sustained, to be more oriented on the national industry. But I think in cooperation with the European states and with the United States, we can do more and be more efficient and effective.
Thank you. Stephen, do you want to react also to this?
I just want to add one thing to Oksana's answer, because I think it's important to point out, we often think of Ukraine as depending upon the assistance of the West to defend itself. But the truth is the Ukrainians have done far more on their own than the Russians. And if you look at the Russians today, the Russians are dependent upon the North Koreans for their artillery and for their missiles. The Iranians, they're dependent upon for their drones. And to prop up their economy, they're dependent upon the generosity of China in particular, but India as well as a source of the technologies that allow them to reconstitute their militaries. The Ukrainians are doing a remarkable job. This invasion by Putin wasn't just a moral stain on the world. It was actually a colossal mistake. He has destroyed his country. Thousands of Western companies have left Russia for a generation. Putin's invasion has driven both Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance. Putin's grip, Russia's grip on the South Caucasus, on Armenia in particular, and Turkey as well, has slipped. Central Asia has slipped into the orbit of China. Putin has fundamentally damaged the geopolitical and economic future of his country. This is a colossal mistake. And when he invaded Ukraine, he invaded a country, and what he found was a nation.
Thanks. I can take 2 or 3 more short questions. Yeah.
Hi. I'm Tom O'Donnell. I work on energy and geopolitics here in Berlin. I'm American, obviously. My question is mainly to Steve Biegun. Earlier on in the administration, what they said is reports were that if the negotiations didn't go well, the cabinet was considering 2 things to put, if they needed to put pressure. One was very significant change in the military aid to Ukraine. The second thing was some really severe sanctions. So it's not going well. They've stuck with it longer. And I'm not sure, I think it's ambiguous whether Trump's going to do it or not, which is he wants to be ambiguous. But it looks like Congress, that's what I wanted to ask you about. I've heard reports in the last few days, people from Washington talking about a bipartisan Lend-Lease program for Kiev, which would take care of things long-term, and not have to go through this back and forth about appropriations. And the second thing was, like Lindsey Graham now is talking about bone-breaking sanctions, and it looks like he's got something like the number of senators you were talking about, 70 on board. But I get maybe it depends on people from what former and present administration I talked to, very back and forth about whether these things will really happen. Maybe if you could. see, what do you think about these possibilities?
There's another question.
Hello, Jürgen Heimseth, former ambassador to Ukraine, now with the Foreign Service Academy. To our American friends, China. We all know China is seen as the biggest challenge in the United States, for the United States in the future. How do you see the war in Ukraine and this, let's say, triangle, United States, Russia, China? Sometimes some voices say, well, Ukraine is not so important. We have to concentrate on China. At the same time, I see in many of the big countries of the global south, they're watching very carefully how US takes position towards Russia in this war, and the outcome of this war will be very important for their view if the US will really stand up to China in the long run. How do you see this? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it on questions. Okay, there's not one.
Yeah, hello, my name is Thomas Gumsheimer. My background is in business. We have heard a lot about the pressure that is going on for Europe, and in particular for the military in Europe. My question simply is probably to Mr. Röttgen. What are the key initiatives to scale up the very nationally oriented military industries so that we not get up to speed quicker, but also using scale in the various business dimensions, both traditional warfare system and also electronic warfare systems?
Okay, then let's close it here. Stephen, maybe we start with you.
Sure. So on the question about penalties to Russia, the president has clearly not reached a point yet where he's willing to make that shift. I think that's self-evident, including from the enthusiastic description of the call with Vladimir Putin on Monday, which really almost the president had to invent a positive take on that phone call. President Trump is sincere in his desire to end this war. He is moved quite personally at the terrible loss of life, at the enormous waste of economic resources, the destruction. But he's not going to be able to will or wish a ceasefire into being. President Putin doesn't want a negotiation. He wants Ukraine. And that's what he's trying to do. That while President Trump has not yet reached that point where he's made up his mind, Congress clearly has. And the support in Congress to put more pressure on Russia is overwhelming. Senator Graham's legislation imposes bone-crushing sanctions, 500% sanctions, which is almost an absurd level. 100% would be a cessation of all trade. But Senator Graham specifically also extends third-party sanctions to those who are buying these energy resources from Russia or who are supplying the sophisticated technologies to the Russian economy, and that is going to significantly be China. So I think it's coming, and there's a couple ways this can happen. It could happen because President Trump reaches the conclusion that Putin is simply stringing us along and has no interest in stopping this war, but rather wants to prosecute it to a full defeat of Ukraine. That's one possibility. The other is the president simply gets out of the way and Congress acts. And there are sufficient votes in the Congress for this to even pass it over a presidential veto. So the Congress has made up its mind. So when we talk about what's the United States view here, it's a more complicated picture, but it's clear the preponderance of view is against Russia in this war. On the question of China, China does fit into this, and China is struggling to reconcile its purported principles of national sovereignty and inviolability of borders with its ongoing both economic and political support for Russia. And China has unquestionably provided that support for Russia. In the United States, we have this debate in some quarters where people thoughtful people will argue that the United States Europe needs to do more for the European defense so the United States can reallocate resources to Asia to head off what potentially could be a threat from China. And I don't disagree fundamentally with that case. You can make a case for the United States needs to reallocate resources. What bothers me is that the people who make that argument give cover for others and allow isolationists to masquerade as strategists. Because the truth is there's a whole group of people who would support neither Ukraine nor Taiwan, and they simply use this argument opportunistically. Yeah, it is a debate that we're having in the United States of America, but my view, pure and simple, is the best China policy is defeat Russia in Ukraine.
Angela, you also want to react to one of the questions? You don't need to. I just want to give you, if you want the last word, yeah, also.
This is just on the China issue. So, one thing that one hears quite a lot from the Trump administration is that one of the reasons to improve ties with Russia, reset ties with Russia, is to try and persuade it that it should distance itself from China and kind of reverse, the policy it's been pursuing, particularly since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. And I think this is an illusion. I mean, as we've heard, Russia couldn't continue this war with Ukraine in the way that it has without China's support. China's buying, number one, usually purchaser of oil. It's supplied Russia with components that it uses for lethal weapons. It backs Russia, obviously, in all international fora. Russia, it's not a symmetrical relationship. It's not an equal relationship, but both Putin and Xi need each other. So I think that's probably not going to happen. And I think in terms of the global South, I mean, I would just say that most of the global South, of course, or all of the global South, has refused to sanction Russia, has refused to take sides in this war. This has to do with its own skepticism about the United States particularly. And even when you make the argument, as I have done with ambassadors from those countries and things like that, well, what about the question of territorial integrity and the UN Charter and the inviolability of borders? They say, yes, well, we do care about it, but they feel that somehow the world is changing and they want to have more agency there. And then I think a number of countries, and I'll end there, particularly in Africa, have welcomed Russia's increased presence there in the past few years because they don't like China's really dominant role in a number of these countries. And so again, they're unlikely to change that. And they think that Ukraine is a European war and that the West, and this is what the Indian foreign minister said, the West wants countries in the global South to care about wars in Europe, but it doesn't care about all the wars that are going on in the global South.
Oksana, you want to have a final word, or you're fine? And then I give it to Norbert Röttgen, the last word.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that definitely, and I hear the questions and I understand the hardships that Europe is facing and our partners in the United States and Canada and many others in terms of price of supporting Ukraine. But I also want to highlight what Norbert was saying, that actually we need also to recognize the price of not supporting Ukraine. And that price is also enormous. And I think that also needs to be communicated so that there is no speculation that once, for instance, Russia succeeds in defeating Ukraine, they will be returned back to the business as usual with Russia. No, it will not. And the situation will change and it will have implications and consequences for decades. So that's why I think that it's important to have this message clear, because Russia manipulates that a lot in Europe and elsewhere.
Norbert Röttgen, please, last word.
We agree in our coalition that what we have to do on European security simply requires a different, and this means a scaled up European industrial base. We simply can't afford the national industries with tailor-made products we have had in the past because we have a different security environment. We can't and we do not want to be only buyers mainly 2/3 of American weapons. This will be an industrial economic side effect of a new political role that, in my view, it's a prediction and it also a will that Germany particularly, but also other European economies like France, like Britain, like Italy, and by this Europe as a continent will emerge as a highly internationally competitive arms producer. This is, in my view, this is something which is going to happen and which will be an economic industrial consequence of a new division of the provision of security for Europe. So this will be a part of the consequence, and we know that we have to organize it. It, of course, is at the core, it's based on industrial cooperation among companies now localized in different European member states. However, it requires political will, the identification of capabilities we want to achieve, and it requires a certain framework of regulation, standardization, so that European production is made possible by European consensus on standards and normative requirements. And this is one of the major achievements we are determined to reach. Without a scaled up arms and defense industry on a European level, we won't be able to achieve it. We need an army on a different size. So the targets and the objectives we have to achieve are clearly defined and are not contested, are clear, and now we simply have to take action to achieve it. The money conditions have been made available, and now it requires the usual national, perhaps European legislation to achieve it.
Okay, we will meet again in 1 year and we'll see the implementation.
We are now for 2 weeks and 2 days in office.
Too early.
So it's a little bit too early to see legislation being passed. We are still in a democracy and we want to preserve it. This is it all about.
Exactly. Thank you very much. It was really a great panel, great discussion. I really enjoyed it very much. Thanks for joining here and thanks for coming. I think we also have a big applause.